Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Isabel Molina, and I am the Public Programs Producer here at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's book talk for The Pope at War, The Secret History of Pius XII, Mussolini, and Hitler. Here at the museum, we are dedicated to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti Semitism, stories of resistance against injustice, and more. Thank you for joining us today virtually. We hope that if you're able, you will visit the museum in person to see our current exhibitions, including Courage to Act, Rescue in Denmark, the museum's first exhibition for visitors ages 9 and up. Closed captions are available on today's program, and instructions on how to turn them on or off are posted in the chat. If you have questions for our speakers during the program, please put them in the Zoom Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the hour. Again, that's the Zoom Q&A box and not the chat. Today, we are honored to be joined by David Kertzer and Charles R. Gallagher. Pulitzer Prize-winning author David Kertzer is the Paul Dupree University Professor of Social Science, Emeritus, and Research Professor at Brown University. His latest book, The Pope at War, The Secret History of Pius XII, Mussolini, and Hitler, which is the subject of today's conversation, was published with Random House in 2022, as well as several foreign editions. David's The Pope and Mussolini, The Secret History of Pius XI and the Rise of Fascism in Europe, published with Random House in 2014, won the Pulitzer Prize for Biography in 2015. It also won the American Historical Association Prize for Best Book in Italian History. Most noteworthy among his numerous other books is The Kidnapping of Edgardo Mortara, which was a finalist for the National Book Award in 1997 and has been published in 18 foreign editions. Past president of both the Social Science History Association and the Society for the Anthropology of Europe, he is co-founder and served for many years as co-editor of the Journal of Modern Italian Studies. In 2005, Kertzer was elected a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and from 2006 to 2011, he was a provost of Brown University. Charles R. Gallagher, S.J., is a Jesuit priest and professor of history at Boston College. For the 2024 through 2025 academic year, he is serving as the Francis C. Wade Chair at Marquette University in Milwaukee. In 2017, he was the William J. Lowenberg Memorial Fellow on America, the Holocaust, and the Jews at the Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies, United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, Washington, D.C. In 2009, his book, Vatican Secret Diplomacy, Joseph R. Hurley and Pope Pius XII, won the American Catholic Historical Association's John Gilmary Shea Prize. His 2021 book, Nazis of Copley Square, The Forgotten History of the Christian Front, was published by Harvard University Press and won a Catholic Press Association Award for History. Gallagher is interested in religion and right-wing movements, the Holocaust, American Catholicism, Vatican diplomacy, and the intersection of religion and espionage. His current Wade Chair project looks at how German intelligence recruited, retained, and used Catholic clerics to act as spies in the United States during World War II. You can purchase The Pope at War at the link in the chat, and you can also purchase Charles Gallagher's book, The Nazis of Copley Square, at the link in the chat as well. Thank you all for joining us. I'm now going to hand things over to David to give a brief overview and background for the context of his book before we head into a discussion between David and Charles. Thank you again.
Thank you, Isabel, and thanks to the Museum of Jewish Heritage. I look forward in a few moments to joining Professor Gallagher, whom I thank for his participation this evening, in discussing this recent book that you just heard about on the controversial Pope Pius XII and his relations with Mussolini and Hitler during the war, during the Second World War. I thought it might be helpful, though, if before we enter into our conversation, for those of you unfamiliar with the book, for me to just say a few words about it. What I try to do in that book is shed new light on the fraught questions of how the controversial Pope Pius XII dealt with the war and with the Holocaust, and why he acted the way he did. In fact, in some ways, my interest in this topic goes back to my childhood and to my father in the war years, because in 1944, he was a Jewish chaplain in the US Army, and he arrived at Anzio Beachhead under fire in early 1944 as they prepared to liberate Rome, and served as a Jewish chaplain there. I think we have a slide of that was published in Look magazine of his holding a service in a wine cellar connection with Passover. But of course, in addition to those whatever personal or family interest I have, there are a lot of scholarly reasons for wanting to look into this history. And there have been so many myths and controversies surrounding the role played by the Pope during the Second World War, that having an opportunity with newly opened archives to shed new light on this topic was just too juicy a topic, I guess, to let go. For many in the church, the Pope remains a heroic figure, a courageous foe of both fascism and Nazism, a great savior of persecuted Jews. For others, as the title of Jordan Cornwell's controversial book would have it, Pius XII was, quote, Hitler's Pope. That's a appellation I wouldn't agree with, but gives you an idea of the acrimony of the controversy around the Pope, where on the one side you have quite a large group trying to make Pius XII a saint, and others, as you see from the title of Cornwell's book, being extremely critical of him. So the question was, the big controversy is over his failure to ever criticize Hitler or denounce the Nazi campaign to try to exterminate the Jews of Europe. Here you see the slide shows probably the debate publicly really was triggered back in the early 60s with this play by a German playwright, The Deputy, that was performed in New York and throughout much of the world, although banned in Italy. Such was the influence of the Vatican there at the time. So as a result of all this controversy, for half a century, really, there's been pressure on the Vatican to open its archives to scholars to make sense of what actually did happen, what the Pope did, and especially why he acted the way he did. As I had previously written a book on Pius XII's predecessor, Pius XI, and his relation with the Mussolini's fascist regime, it seemed logical for me to continue the story. In fact, the man who would become Pius XI's successor, Pius XII, was the Secretary of State, the kind of number two man to Pius XI throughout the 1930s. So he was a personage I was very familiar with from my earlier work. Like many of my colleagues, I was waiting impatiently for the decision to open the archives of Pius XII, the decision that could only be made by the current Pope. But I kind of made a bet that Pope Francis would eventually authorize the opening of those archives for the World War II years and for the papacy of Pius XII. And so I began working in the archives that were open, the state archives in Italy, in Germany, in France, in Britain, and the US. In each case, each of these countries had an envoy or an ambassador to the Holy See who was sending reports practically on a daily basis back to Berlin, to Vichy or Paris, to London, to Rome, and so forth, on their daily conversations with, sometimes with the Pope, more frequently with the people around the Pope. So my timing turned out to be good. I had largely completed my work in those other archives, digitizing tens of thousands of documents, many only recently declassified or recently cataloged, when Pope Francis made the announcement that he was authorizing the opening of those archives for the papacy of Pius XII. And so there was great excitement on March 2nd, 2020, about 5 years ago, when a group of us waited expectantly early in the morning outside the Vatican Apostolic Archive for the door to open. There you see me with, right next to me is a quite prominent German historian, Hubert Wolff, also both a prominent professor and a priest. And his kind of phalanx, the German senior professors seem to have advantages we more senior faculty in the US don't have, of being able to bring with them a group of assistants. But we were only working those newly opened archives for a week. If people remember what happened in March 2020, and especially in Italy, which was the epicenter of this new virus that was going around, at least outside of China, and they closed the archives until further notice. Fortunately, I have an associate who works with me who's Roman. So when they opened the archives 3 months later, and still people, even Italians, weren't allowed to cross provincial borders, Roberto Benedetti, my colleague, was able to work daily in those archives. And so the result is when I wrote my book, I also ended up with thousands of pages of archival material that was digitized for me for the purposes of this research. Their value is greatly increased by the fact I could triangulate them with the observations on the same events, often the same meetings, reported on the documents I was able to find in those other archives, the Italian, German, French, British, American archives. There were those who said nothing much new would come out of those newly opened archives. You saw before that slide which showed the 12 volumes that were published by the Vatican of archival material bearing on the war in the Vatican, published between 1965 and 1981. So some said, oh, we've already know all that's relevant. But what in fact we found is that much had remained hidden, much misunderstood, I think. Partly this was due to very effective efforts by the Vatican to keep part of the history hidden, as might mention the secret negotiations that we discovered that Hitler entered into with the Pope through Hitler's personal envoy, a man, Philipp von Hessen, who was also happened not only to be a Nazi aristocrat, but was married to the daughter of the King of Italy. Yeah, they're with Hitler. Or to take another example of new material that's come out, the Vatican's tireless focus on having both the fascist regime and then the Nazi SS treat baptized Jews as Catholics and not as Jews. Or something else that I think is new is the extent of anti-Semitic bias and the private advice that the Pope was getting from some of the prelates of the Vatican Secretariat of State. But probably the most dramatic event and most gets at the heart of the question of should the Pope have acted differently had to do with the roundup of the Jews of Rome when 350 SS were sent to Rome. And early on the morning of October 16th, 1943, they went around with lists of all the Jews in the city and arrested over 1,000 of them, put them in a holding area, military college right outside the walls of Vatican City, and held them there for 2 days, and then sent them off to Auschwitz, all without the Pope making any public protest. So I would just say, I mean, I don't know if this is in defense of the Pope, but as someone who also works more generally in Italian history, what I take to be the misrepresentation of this history is part of a larger, from my point of view, misrepresentation that one finds in Italy, of Italy's history during the war, where people don't like to remember. I often get the idea that Italians think they were on the side of the Allies, not on the Axis during the war. And certainly the fact that the Italian church hierarchy called on all good Catholics to do their part in the Axis war, these are things best forgotten. But it's also true that Italy has something like 60 centers for the study of the resistance, but basically no center for the study of the 20 years of fascism in Italy. So there's some things that are just, I guess, better forgotten. Well, that was just a kind of brief capsule idea of what the book tries to deal with, and now look forward to my conversation with Professor Gallagher.
So thank you, David, and thank you, Isabel, for moderating this. Just a preliminary remark before I begin my questions. Your book, David, which is a full monograph with a tremendous arc in addressing these questions or entertaining these questions about the Pope. And I think the questions are ultimately, for us, connected to the morality of the decision making during these periods. That's why I think they're rather juicy. As I've always thought since I was a high school student, the Pope is the only person in the world who puts himself forward as a true moral arbiter in a public sense. He claims to be a moral arbiter. Just want to let our viewers and listeners know that the book that you published, The Pope at War in 2022, is still, as far as I can see, the only true monograph which has accessed the Vatican Apostolic Archives, formerly called Vatican Secret Archives. And so it's the only single author monograph. We have a book that's come out last year, 2024, edited by Nina Villabusque, about Pius XII as a global as the global Pope. But in terms of the book itself, a number of questions were raised. The first was, again, one of the more explosive kind of and again brand new news from the book was this relationship between Prince Philip von Hessen, an early adopter of Nazism, a German aristocrat, and his negotiations face to face with Hitler on behalf of Pope Pius XII. So it's an intermediary relationship. I've often thought that Pius XII had a proclivity towards personal diplomacy. And I thought that, and secret diplomacy, the title of my first book was Vatican Secret Diplomacy. So keeping this out of the public eye and using an intermediary who ran below the radar is surprising, but also not surprising in terms of how Pius XII would continue to conduct his diplomacy. And I think that's, in my view, because he was trained as a diplomat in the old style, in the before the turn of the century, 1900. In my view, he was trained to be amenable to working only with principals and only with nobles. The diplomatic school that he attended at the Vatican was called the Pontifical Academy of Noble Ecclesiastics. Mm-hmm. So, in my view, he's going to have a bias towards, when talking about serious issues like war and peace, he's only really going to want to talk to other aristocrats about that. And I say other aristocrats because Pius XII considered himself to be a member of what was known as the Black nobility in Rome and in Italy. And he, in my view, I've always felt that he saw himself as aristocratic in terms of his lineage and in terms of his manner of diplomacy. He was not an early adopter of the democratic style of diplomacy. And so I think he felt, so when you see him cozying up to an emissary who's wearing a Nazi swastika armband, he might be seeing that person also as an aristocrat who he can do business with. And so I think that's one of the features that makes me think that he feels comfortable, if you will, with dealing with von Hessen. As far as David, your book goes, and it's a monumental work in terms of tracking all of the papal decision making from the prior to the beginning of the hot war through 1943 and Stalingrad through the changes of the war. It's really a monumental work. And it's an easy read because of the pace within which the book is written. My question is, from a Catholic perspective, though, I think Pius XII was also working from concepts of Catholic philosophy and Catholic theology, which both inhibited him from making outright claims against the Nazis. Philosophically, the ironclad situation for Catholics was a grounding in St. Thomas Aquinas's philosophies of church and state, which always deferred towards never criticizing civilly constituted governments publicly in terms of diplomacy. And so, as we know, Hitler came to power legally through the electoral process. And so Catholic philosophy was geared towards not criticizing leaders who had been civilly constituted. They didn't say democratically elected, but they said civilly constituted. And so that was one, I think, big drawback for Pius. And I'd like to get David's reaction to that, because we've been asked about asking questions.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I guess a couple of things about that. We could also talk about the question of the background of Pope Pacelli, Pius XII. I think you rightly referred to both his being identified as a part of the Black aristocracy in Italy, and he spent 12 years in Germany from 1917 to 1929 as the nuncio or ambassador from the Holy See to Germany, where he was very comfortable spending a lot of time with the German Catholic elite, whether aristocrats or barons of business, and he was not spending time with Nazis, but he was very comfortable with you might say mainstream conservative elite, and he also was in some ways unusual as a pope, perhaps not that unusual back in the days when only aristocrats became pope, but he really had no significant pastoral experience. He, not just as a parish priest, but as a diocesan bishop, he just didn't have that kind of background. So he went right into the diplomatic service practically from his ordination in the latter part of the 19th century. I would say that in terms of the question of Catholic theology inhibiting him, certainly he drew on that. I would, however, point out for a couple of things. One is his predecessor, and he, of course, was at the time his number 2 as Secretary of State, as you well know, 1936, issued an encyclical blasting the Nazi regime and had it read from ideally every pulpit in Germany, much, of course, to Hitler's horror. Not blasting them for their treatment of the Jews, but largely for their treatment of the church and for their paganism. So, he had training of someone of a very different caste and different proclivity in terms of being willing, when the issues were significant enough, to very publicly criticize a government. The other thing, I guess, is I would make a distinction between, you might say, normal wars or wars between states and a program of marching hundreds of thousands of children and old people into the gas chambers. And so I think that even a theology about, well, in war, I mean, the Pope, after all, is the spiritual leader of Catholics worldwide. Therefore, when different states who have Catholic populations are at war, he's, by nature in a kind of an awkward situation. But we're not, I think what has made the controversy about Pius XII's silence so great was it wasn't, if there had not been the Holocaust, let's just say Germany invades Poland and France and so forth, and there's a war as the First World War, that would be one thing. But as for example, the Jews of Rome were being rounded up and sent to their death, he shouldn't criticize because of Catholic theology. This seems odd.
It does seem odd, and I think that's one of the areas that kind of pains me when I deal with issues connected to Pope Pius XII is that you almost want to shake him and say, why can't you see this? But then these larger questions come up. I mean, I think, are we, so we see these questions in the light of the UN Declaration on Human Rights. And as Catholics, we see them in the light of Vatican II and Nostra Aetate, and it makes sense to us. But in the context of the times, I'm wondering if it's just asking a little bit too much for this person who is so trained in the old school. And so he's falling short in connection to human solidarity, I think, and seeing any solidarity between Roman Catholics and Jews as fellow humans. The theology isn't there yet for the Catholics. And the theology that is there is the theology from the Protestant Reformation, which says Protestant problems are Protestant problems. They're not to be entered into by Catholics or expounded upon by Catholics. Jewish problems are Jewish problems. And all of these religions are singular in their own right, and they're siloed. And the idea that a pope would speak out about an issue on another religion is in many cases new. The other piece that I think the historian Ian Kershaw gets right is that World War II is really the first war where the ingredient of ideology is the driver. And I think Pacelli, this is Pius XII, simply doesn't get it. He doesn't see ideology as a driving force. In other words, I still think he's working with the conceptualizations of the previous war, of World War I. I just don't think he sees ideology as being able to make a drive towards death camps. And also within the constructions of the day, there was never really the idea of extermination. I don't think it entered into the lexicon even at that point. They always called it persecution. And I think for religious people, there was a lot of discussion about persecutions. I think the idea that a war machine could actually exterminate a civilian population, I just don't think it dawned on Pius XII.
Well, I think I would take issue with that because, we do know he was getting reports largely from church sources and bishops on an German-occupied Europe about the slaughter of Jews, hundreds of thousands of Jews being slaughtered. So, he was learning about this more or less as it was happened. He had as good an intelligence service as any government or better, with a huge network of Catholic, churches and priests and bishops and so on throughout most of Europe. I think you are onto something in terms of this pre-Second Vatican Council ideology of, I'm Pope, I'm responsible for the world's Catholics, Jews are somebody else's problems, Protestants, someone else's problems and so on. So there is certainly some of that, but I think, my own feeling of responsibility, if we want to talk about moral issues, largely in the book, I try to leave this to my kind of postscript because as hopefully good historian, it's not here are the good guys, there are the bad guys, this is good, this is bad, but try to understand what's happening from the point of view of the people involved. But he had to be concerned about protecting the church initially in the first years of the war in Europe that many thought for good reason was going to come under Hitler's sway. Hitler, if we think especially after the spring of 1940, when Hitler supposed to be this impregnable Maginot Line, and they just marched right to Paris in a matter of weeks and so on. And then, having marched through Poland the previous fall. So, his concern in the early years of the war, I think, it was part of what I argue in the book, is to protect the church in a German ruled Europe with Mussolini as a junior partner. The other thing, though, and I think this is where I see the moral responsibility to get back to that question, who was murdering all these Jews? Now, from my reading, it wasn't for the most part people who thought they were pagans. There were people who, when they went home, went with their wives to church. I mean, who thought they were good Christians. Of course, not just Catholics, more Protestants than Catholics. But what had they been learning about Jews? What did they know about Jews, and what impact did the teachings of the church about Jews have? Teachings that have been demonization of Jews that have been going on for centuries, and of course, with the Second Vatican Council got repudiated, thankfully. So when we talk about what kind of moral responsibility the Pope may have had, I think, from my point of view, part of that responsibility derives from the fact that Christianity had been employed to demonize Jews for centuries and help make possible. Obviously, the church never intended this to happen, but talk about unintended consequences, perhaps, that made possible for thousands, tens of thousands, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of Germans and their collaborators to murder small Jewish children and old people, and then go back and go to church that Sunday with their wives and families. So yeah, that for me that kind of looms large. I mean, the other issue about their who was killing the Jews is the Pope was also worried about creating a schism in the church. I mean, there was a schism in the Protestant churches, as you well know, that came about having to do with the Nazification of some of the churches, the Protestant churches, and not to mention the Germany from a Holy See point of view, the scene of the Reformation in the 16th century. So I think the Pope was also concerned that, particularly in the latter years of the war, when it looked like Hitler was going to lose, that he would be, if he now started criticizing the Germans and the German war effort and the German government, he might get blamed later, thinking of the stab in the back theory from World War I and its impact, that the Catholic Church could be split, could suffer loss of German following and so forth. So from my reading of the evidence, these are largely the motivating forces for the Pope.
Yeah, I think as you mentioned, the one Pope that did with a full-throated condemnation condemn Germany as aggressor was his predecessor, Pope Pius XI. Pope Pius XI, this is kind of one I shake my head as a Catholic at some of these ironies. Pope Pius XI is the only Pope of the 20th century that either isn't being looked into as being a saint or hasn't been made a saint. And in my view, I just find that amazing. I find it sad, but amazing. And then, Pope Pius XII, who we're talking about now, has a cause for canonization, that sainthood opened up for him. It's at the first stages, but he's been declared to have heroic virtue because he has gone through the stage. And as a historian, I just don't see it. I mean, I think that of all the people that could have been Pope at that period in history, in terms of, and I'm speaking as a Catholic, that the church may have needed, he was probably the most ill-equipped. Now, at the time that he was elected, on the surface, he checked all the boxes. In fact, he looked the most equipped of all people to assume the papacy. But I think interiorly, in terms of, so this is my reason I say that. I think that if you're on the road to sainthood, you need to have within you a bit of the prophet. Like you need to have a bit of the prophet in you. You need to be able to look 10 years ahead. You need to be able to kind of take your relationship with God and figure it out in terms of best interests going forward. I just think he was so stuck in his training as a diplomat and in his kind of his narrow-mindedness about human solidarity, that we weren't able to get to that point really until Pope John the 23rd and Pope Paul VI, his successors.
Yeah, but you began your comments talking about the role the Pope is moral arbiter.
Yeah.
I guess the way, I think about it, the Pope has kind of two major roles, that he's the head of a very large, now what, over 1 billion members, hundreds of thousands of dependents in terms of clergy and so on. It's a very large organization that he is, in a way, the CEO of and responsible for its health. But he's also a moral figure and is viewed by the faithful as a moral leader. And so I guess one way that I would look at this history in World War II and the Pope is that these two roles kind of collided, that he tended to focus on protecting the institutional church, and that maybe we could say in this light at the expense of his more prophetic or moral leadership role.
In connection to that moral leadership role, I do think that he had a long view for the church. I think that he personally was still dealing with the ramifications of the loss of the Papal States in 1870. I think he wanted the papacy to become a part of the solution to World War II. I think he wanted to be present at the negotiating tables of the peace, and I think that's why this, in your book, you talk mainly about papal neutrality. In all of the documents produced by Pope Pius XII during the war, he never uses the term neutrality. He always uses the term impartiality, and in many ways, absolute impartiality. And I think he picked this up from his training as a diplomat, that in the Hague conferences in 1899 and 1907, there was a special section for neutrals, that during neutrals in wartime, if they observed absolute impartiality, not neutrality, but absolute impartiality, which is a heightened and tightened sense of being impartial, that they would be able to move into the international community in a way that would allow them to take the upper hand in terms of negotiating the peace. And I think this was always a desire of Pius XII. So I think many times his proclivity not to say things forthrightly is, I think, because he had this, and it's actually a technical diplomatic maneuver within the world of international diplomacy to abide by absolute impartiality. And I think that's where he decided to cast his lot, and I think it was a monumental mistake, not only for the Jews. Yeah,
there's there's another conflict I think he had in terms of his official roles, because unlike Poland or other Catholic countries that have cardinal primates, Italy has not, because the Bishop of Rome is in essence the primate of the clergy, the church hierarchy in Italy. And when the decision that Mussolini made in June 1940, so only several months after the war had begun, to join in the war at Hitler's side, was not necessarily a popular one from the Italian population, who didn't necessarily have great fondness for the Germans after World War I. Plus the whole idea of Aryan supremacy wasn't going to go over that well in Sicily and so on. So it was going to be a problem for Mussolini to convince the Italians that they should, join the war effort and be mobilized for war. And as soon as he made that announcement, June 10th, 1940, the Italian hierarchy, as the German hierarchy did, however, the difference is the German hierarchy more recently apologized for this, the Italian hierarchy is not. The Italian hierarchy and all the church institutions got out the word that all Italians need to do their duty as good Catholics and follow Mussolini into the war. So, there's impartiality, but as Bishop of Rome, what exactly was he able to be impartial? I mean, could he be? The other thing we haven't mentioned in terms of his attitude and his action is communism. And I think, this is also, he didn't want to see Germany destroyed. He saw Germany, aside from Nazism per se, but he saw Germany as a bulwark against the expansion of Soviet communism. And again, if we look back at what was going on, and this also, by the way, how Mussolini came to power in 1922, just 5 years after the Russian Revolution, this fear of communism, and it would not subside through the 1930s, and of course, Hitler come to power. So, this, especially when it looked like the Allies might win, and when you talk about wanting to broker a solution, part of the reason for wanting to broker it is to prevent the total destruction of the Italian state and the Italian government, which he was afraid, and perhaps for good reason, would lead to the expansion of Soviet communism.
Yes, I think in your book, that kind of sub-theme of the fear of repercussions, both particularly in Italy, is present there.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a number of things I could say, but I think if you'd like to make a final comment, David, I think then we could go to the Q&A, if that's okay. Isabella?
I'm happy. I'm always eager to hear what questions people have, but so if we can continue, if there are not some questions, I think Isabel was going to keep track of them.
Yes, we have, there I am, just waiting for my face to appear. We do have a number of questions, so certainly enough to fill up the rest of the hour, the next 15 minutes. But of course, David and Charles, if there's anything else you two would like to say before we head over to questions, that's totally fine as well.
Well, I just, well, first of all, I'd like to thank Isabel for helping arrange this, and especially Professor Gallagher for participating in this conversation. These issues, I mean, it's amazing for me, the defensiveness that I still find. I think people say, yeah, what's the Vatican reaction or what's the church reaction? And one thing that should be clear from Professor Gallagher is you can't talk about the church or even the Vatican. They're very heterogeneous organizations, institutions, religion. But when my book, the Italian edition of my book came out, it was immediately denounced in the pages of both the Vatican's daily newspaper, L'Osservatore Romano, and the daily newspaper of the church hierarchy in Italy, L'Avvenire, in full page, or in one case, a page and a half devoted to denouncing it. So, it's, from my point of view, unfortunate, because the church, first of all, many in the church are eager to come to terms with this history, do realize that the official position, official narrative of the church is misleading at best. And we're seeing some of the Catholic church hierarchies, as I mentioned, Germany most recently, but I think before that in some other European countries, beginning to come to terms with this history, and not just pronouncing it in courageous, heroic terms, but in the kind of messy, complicated, sometimes morally ambiguous way that I think it really presents itself.
Yeah, I think for Catholic, for historians who are Catholic, I think David Kertzer's research kind of paves the way for how Catholic scholars should and can approach these issues, in terms of going right to the sources, to being judicious with the sources. And that's where the further conversation and any clarity that we can get is going to come from.
Thank you. And David, you actually answered one of the questions I was going to ask from our audience, which was, what was the reaction to your book? So thank you. Just a note to our audience, apologies in advance if we don't get to your question. We probably will have some we don't get to, just for time's sake. Also, if we have some questions that are similar to each other, I'll also try to combine those, just so that we can try to get to as many as possible. Starting off, we have some audience members who are asking about your research process, David, when writing the book, and particularly about the archives once they were opened. So I'll I'll throw you just two questions about this. The first, someone is wondering if you could talk a little bit more about why exactly it was that these archives were sealed for so long. And then we have a couple questions also about your reaction to finally getting to see what was in these archives, if they changed or influenced or impacted your assessment of the Pope's actions during the war, and if there was maybe one particular piece in the archives that had a fundamental shift for you or was the most impactful thing that you discovered during your research.
Okay. Well, I mean, why the archives were sealed so long, in many state archives, there may be like a 50-year rule or a 75-year rule. In the case of Vatican archives, by the way, when we talk about Vatican archives in general, the other ecclesiastical bodies follow the Vatican. For example, the Central Jesuit archives are very important to my research, and they followed the opening. Not all church organizations do, but it's up in the church, in the Vatican, it's up to the current Pope to decide when it's time to open the archives for the papacy, the next papacy in line to be opened. And as I mentioned, there have been pressure since the 1960s to open the archives of Pius XII because of all the controversy about the war. But because the archives are open for the whole papacy, not by year, and Pius XII papacy only ended with his death in 1958. Part of the argument of the church was, it hasn't been that long, and we usually wait longer, and so forth. In terms of whether the opening, what we found in those newly opened archives shifted my view, I'd say, so on the one hand, we knew the Pope didn't speak out against the Holocaust, so we're not, in that sense, there's no great revelation. Where the revelations come, I think, are what was going on behind the scenes throughout, and helping us understand what kind of advice the Pope was getting and what he was deciding to do. I think one of the things that really struck me is how much concern there was in the Vatican for converted Jews, for baptized Jews. And there, certainly with the so-called racial laws, for example, in Italy that were persecuting the Jews beginning in 1938, the Vatican, the Pope, the people around the Pope, the Secretary of State were working tirelessly to have Jews who had been baptized, who had converted, to be treated as, in the language of the time, as Aryans and not as members of the Jewish race. So there are some aspects like that I think really have shed new light on what we now know.
Thank you for that great answer. I know I threw a bunch of different things at you with that first question. We have something sort of related as well to your research. Someone is wondering kind of separately if, while you were researching for this book, if you came across anything about resistance efforts in Italy and how the Pope may have known or not known or done anything to hamper or help those resistance efforts.
I'd say the Pope was not a big fan of the resistance in Italy. For example, in Rome, they were the church when the Germans, Mussolini is overthrown July 25th of 1943, and then when the announcement is made that the Italians are getting out of the war, Hitler sends in the German troops early September, and they take over most of the peninsula, including Rome. So for 9 months, Rome is under German occupation. And the Vatican, and so the Pope was behind this, is constantly putting out word against the resistance, that people should obey the authorities, that we don't want more violence. So now that doesn't mean there weren't individual priests involved in the resistance, which there were, but certainly not because the Pope was supporting those kind of efforts.
Got you. Thank you. Then we also have some other questions about if you encountered anything in your research about how the Pope felt or acted towards other victims who weren't Jewish, but who were victims of the war and of the Holocaust as well, if his response was similar or different to knowing or not knowing about those victims as well.
Yeah, and I wouldn't say the Pope was, I mean, privately, of course, the Pope was not happy about any of this. He was, so if you want to know, privately what he thought, and be very pained, he was not happy that 1,000 Jews were being rounded up in Rome and so on. But if you look at, for example, in Italy, getting at the resistance in the spring of 1944 during German occupation blew up a bunch of German soldiers. And as punishment, there were 35, I think, who were killed. Hitler ordered that 10 Italians be murdered for every German soldier who'd been killed. And so they took out 350 Italians, actually about 75 of whom were Jews, to a cave outside the city of Rome and murdered them. And again, the Pope certainly wasn't happy about this, but he would not protest that either, though. So in this case, most of them were Catholic. They were mostly not Jews. So in that sense, again, privately may have been pained, but he was not speaking out about. I mean, he's speaking very generally throughout this, from even before the war began, against war and the horrors of war and so forth, but at a very general, abstract level.
Gotcha. Thank you for elaborating on that. We have a couple questions, not particularly about your research, but about people who are wondering about some other texts that they could look at if they want to engage with this material. In addition to, of course, reading your books, someone particularly is asking if there's any books or research that you'd recommend about the history of the Papal States, or anything else that might be kind of a great companion piece to your text as well.
Well, I shouldn't recommend my own books, but I mean, I have.
You should.
I don't know. I seem to have a thing for Pope Pius because I've written now a number of books that kind of cover 19th and 20th century because my interest has been more generally in the relationship of the politics and religion in Italy, which means basically the Vatican, the Catholic Church, and the political situation in Italy. So the books from the kidnapping of Edgardo Mortara through the Pope Mussolini and this most recent book, I think are all books that one might be interested in. In terms of the more specific topic, Susan Zacconi's book, Under His Very Window, which now came out quite a few years ago, I think, remains a very good book about this question of how the Pope and the Vatican reacted during the roundup of Jews in the country. There are Professor Gallagher mentioned the lack of other books, at least in English, of the sort that mine is. There are a couple of books being published in other languages, including Nina Val-Bousquet, who's a French scholar, has published for the French readers just this past year a very good book on this subject as well.
Awesome. Thank you. That's definitely a lot of good recommendations for further reading. So we have about 5 more minutes, which is time for a couple more questions. I can say confidently we're not going to get to everybody's, so apologies for that, but thank you so much for submitting questions. We have a couple that I think might be nice to end on. A couple people have commented and asked about, obviously we're readers today reading about this history, and they're wondering, aside from, the obvious history that you're uncovering in this book, and this is hard because it's a long and important book, but people are wondering, what do you think would be the major takeaway or lesson that you'd want readers today to really take away from this book? I know it's a very difficult question.
Yeah, there are, I guess, different lists. I mean, at the more general level, there are unpleasant aspects of everybody's history, and particularly if we talk more corporately of, as an American, for example, not just as an individual, that we would just as soon forget or gets misrepresented. But I think, I mean, as right now, there's so much concern about dictatorship, for example. and how people end up backing things that are anti-humane, you might say, at a very general level. I mean, for me, people ask me sometimes, because I've written so much about Mussolini, do I have some valuable perspective on our current American political leader because of being an expert on Mussolini? And my response is normally kind of just the inverse, which is I now understand how Mussolini came to power much better because of what's been going on in the United States and how people go along with certain things. So I think the more we study this kind of history, the more sensitive we can be to the dangerous path and how easily it can be taken and justified.
Thank you. That was a great answer to what I know is a very difficult question. Um, so I think this will be the last question of the evening. Some other people are wondering sort of what's next for you and also what's next for, this research. Do you see it going anywhere? And I'd also like to open it up to Professor Gallagher as well. I know you work in very related fields. So if either of you have some insight of kind of what's next for you both in this scholarly work as well.
Maybe I'll let Professor Gallagher get the first shot at that.
Thanks, David. So where my research is going, I'm trained as an Americanist mainly. I'm going to work on a guy named Joseph McWilliams, who was founder of a group called the Christian Mobilizers. They were the first anti-Semitic group to form a political party in the United States. They formed something called the American Destiny Party. Now, no one has ever heard of this, but they were supported by the German American Bund. No one's written about McWilliams. He was the lead defendant on the largest sedition case in American history, and he was virulently anti-Semitic, and there's virtually nothing written about him. And I'm looking into that case, and I have another project, but that's mainly in terms of American Jewish history and the Holocaust, or the ideas resonant in the Holocaust. I'm going to be working on that.
Yeah, I would say I can't wait to read that book. But yeah, I've been working on something that talk about things that people want to forget. In this case, both I think Italian Jews as well as Catholics. When the racial laws I mentioned before came on, which were laws in 1938, anti-Semitic laws that threw Jewish children out of school, fired all Jewish teachers and professors, and threw most Italian Jews out of their jobs. I immiserated them. So there was a way out that many saw it through baptism. They thought by getting baptized, they could escape the worst effects of the anti-Semitic persecution. And in fact, thousands of Italian Jews got baptized within a year of those racial laws, so 38, 39. And then applied, and this is what I found particularly intriguing, and this led me to find, working with 2,100 cases of this sort. These are people who've been categorized as Jews under the racial laws who applied to the government to change their racial categorization to Aryan, not Jewish, based primarily on baptismal records of themselves and ancestors they could claim. So it's kind of embarrassing for Jews in Italy. And it's not something I think most in the church are particularly eager to call attention to. It brings up some awkward questions. I mean, I see this as a kind of new form of inquisition. So, but this is a book that I hope will come out next year.
Well, thank you both. And I personally can say I'm looking forward to books from both of you. We are very prompt. It's 8:01. So good job to us for getting right on time. I'd like to thank you both for such a great discussion and question and answer session tonight. Also, thank you so much to our audience who joined us from all over the US and internationally.